Abigail Foster pressed her back against the weathered wood of the jail cell, her heart hammering as the two men standing outside discussed her fate as if she were cattle at auction. It was 1876, and she had learned that in Copper Creek, Arizona territory, a woman alone was considered property to be claimed, not a person with her own will. "She's worth at least $50 to you, Sheriff Patterson," the taller of the two men said, his voice grating like rusty nails. "Pretty little thing, ain't she? Found her trying to steal a horse from our camp. Figured the law might want her more than we do." Sheriff Patterson, a man whose belly strained the buttons of his vest and whose eyes never seemed to blink enough, peered through the bars at Abigail. "What's your name, girl?" Abigail lifted her chin, determined not to show fear despite the tear in her dress and the dirt smudged across her cheeks. "My name is not for sale, nor am I." The taller man laughed, the sound ugly and harsh. "See, got spirit too. Perfect for entertaining your deputies when they get lonesome." Abigail felt bile rise in her throat. This couldn't be happening. Not in America. Not in 1876. She had fled east to escape an arranged marriage only to find herself facing something far worse. "I'll give you 30, Sheriff Patterson countered, running his thick fingers through his greasy mustache. "Can't afford more with tax collection down this month." The door to the sheriff's office swung open with such force that it slammed against the wall. All eyes turned to the figure silhouetted in the doorway, tall, broad-shouldered, with a Stetson pulled low over his eyes. "She's my wife already." The voice was deep, steady, and belonged to a man Abigail had never seen before in her life. He stepped into the lamplight, revealing a face weathered by sun and wind, with eyes the color of a summer sky. A cowboy from his worn boots to his trail-dusted clothes. "Nathan," Abigail said, her mind racing to play along with whatever scheme this stranger was offering. "You found me." The cowboy's gaze flicked to her briefly, a silent message to continue the ruse. "Been tracking her for 3 days," he said, approaching the cell. "Abigail's been touched in the head since the fever last spring, wanders off sometimes." He turned to the sheriff, voice hardening. "I'd appreciate it if you'd release my wife immediately, Sheriff." The two would-be sellers looked skeptical. "Your wife, Neal? Never heard you mention no wife before." "Nathan Neal," the cowboy corrected smoothly. "Recently married and moved to these parts." "Don't recall making your acquaintance, so I wouldn't have mentioned her to you." He reached into his pocket and produced a small leather pouch. "I'll pay her fine for the attempted horse theft. How much?" The sheriff looked between Nathan and Abigail, suspicion evident on his face. "If she's your wife, where's your wedding band? And hers?" Abigail's heart sank. They were caught in the lie. Nathan didn't miss a beat. "Pawned them in Tucson to buy feed for our livestock after the drought killed half our crops, planning to buy them back after the next harvest." He jingled the coins in his hand. "Now, how much for my wife's release?" The sheriff's eyes narrowed, but greed won over suspicion. $10 for the fine, 5 for keeping her here." Nathan counted out the money without argument, his eyes never leaving Abigail's. When the cell door swung open, he stepped forward and gently took her arm. "Come along, darling. You've caused enough trouble for one day." Abigail slipped her arm through his, playing the part of the dutiful wife. "I'm sorry, dear, I got confused again." They walked out of the jailhouse together, arm in arm, neither speaking until they were well away from the sheriff's office and into the maze of Copper Creek's dusty streets. "Thank you," Abigail whispered finally, her voice shaking. "I don't know who you are, but you saved me from a fate worse than death back there." Nathan Neal looked down at her, his expression unreadable in the gathering dusk. "You're welcome, Mrs. Neal." There was the slightest hint of amusement in his voice. "Though I reckon we should get our story straight if we're going to convince this town we're married." "I don't understand. Why would we need to? Those men who brought you in, they work for Silas Morgan. He owns half this county and most of the sheriff. If they think I lied, they'll come looking for both of us." He guided her toward the livery stable at the end of the street. "So for tonight at least, you're Abigail Neal, my loving wife." Abigail pulled away slightly, studying his face for any sign of deception. "And tomorrow." Nathan stopped walking, turning to face her fully. "Tomorrow I'll take you wherever you want to go, you have my word." Something in his steady gaze made Abigail believe him, or perhaps it was simply that she had no other choice. "I have nowhere to go," she admitted. I was trying to reach California to start a new life. Well then, Mrs. Neal, he said, offering his arm again, let's get you fed and rested, and tomorrow we'll figure out the rest. As they entered the stable to retrieve Nathan's horse, Abigail couldn't help but wonder if she had jumped from the frying pan into the fire. Yet something about Nathan Neal's quiet strength gave her hope that perhaps, just this once, luck had turned her way. The room above the general store was small but clean, with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a single chair by the window. Nathan had paid for it with more of his dwindling funds, introducing Abigail as his wife to the storekeeper's curious wife. "I'll sleep on the floor," Nathan said, dropping his saddlebags in the corner. "You take the bed." Abigail stood awkwardly by the door, painfully aware of her disheveled appearance. "I can't thank you enough for what you've done, Mr. Neal." "Nathan," he corrected, removing his hat and running a hand through his sandy hair. "If we're supposed to be married, you should probably use my given name." "Nathan," she repeated softly. "I'm truly Abigail Foster, though I prefer Abby." She hesitated, then asked, "Why did you help me?" Nathan busied himself with untying his bedroll. No decent man would let a woman be sold like property. He paused, looking up at her. "Besides, I've had my own troubles with Sheriff Patterson and his selective law enforcement." "Are you an outlaw?" Abigail asked, suddenly wary. A small smile cracked his serious expression. "No, madam, just a rancher trying to make a living on land that more powerful men want." He stood, reaching for his hat again. "I'll fetch us some supper while you get settled. There's water in the pitcher if you want to wash up." When he was gone, Abigail sank onto the bed, exhaustion washing over her. How had her life come to this? 3 weeks ago, she had been the daughter of a prosperous merchant in Boston, expected to marry the elderly business partner her father had chosen. Now she was pretending to be the wife of a stranger in a dusty Arizona town, with nothing to her name but the clothes on her back. She poured water into the basin and washed her face and hands, wincing at the dirt that came away. Using the small mirror hanging above the washstand, she attempted to restore some order to her once neat chestnut hair. Nathan returned with a tray of food, beans, cornbread, and coffee, setting it on the small table by the window. "Not exactly what you're used to, I imagine," he said, noting the way she eyed the simple fare. "How do you know what I'm used to?" Abigail asked, taking the seat he offered. "Your hands," he replied simply. "Soft, no calluses, and despite your current state, your clothes were fine quality once." He poured her a cup of coffee. "You're a long way from home, Abigail Foster." Abigail wrapped her fingers around the warm cup. "Home stopped being home when my father decided to trade me for a business merger." The bitterness in her voice surprised even her. "So you ran." It wasn't a question. "Yes," she looked up at him, defiance in her green eyes. "Wouldn't you?" Nathan considered this, breaking a piece of cornbread. "I suppose I would. Freedom's worth fighting for." He passed her the plate. "Eat, tomorrow will come soon enough." They ate in comfortable silence, the sounds of the town winding down for the night drifting through the open window. When they finished, Nathan took the tray downstairs while Abigail prepared for bed, keeping her dress on but removing her shoes and the pins from her hair. When he returned, he spread his bedroll on the floor without complaint, removed his boots, and stretched out, hat over his face. "Good night, Mrs. Neal," came his muffled voice. "Good night, Mr. Neal," she replied, blowing out the lamp. Despite her exhaustion, sleep eluded Abigail. "Nathan." She whispered into the darkness. He sounded alert, as if he hadn't been close to sleep either. "Those men who tried to sell me, they'll come back, won't they?" There was a long pause. "Probably," he admitted. "But not tonight. Get some sleep, Abby." The use of her preferred name, spoken with such gentle assurance, finally allowed her to close her eyes, secure in the knowledge that for tonight at least, she was safe. Morning came with the crowing of roosters and the clatter of wagons on the street below. Abigail opened her eyes to find Nathan already up, hat on, looking out the window with a tent set to his shoulders. "What is it?" she asked, sitting up quickly. "Morgan's men," he said without turning. "4 of them talking to the sheriff." He glanced back at her. "We need to leave, now." Abigail scrambled to her feet, hastily pinning up her hair. "Where will we go?" "My ranch. It's a day's ride north of here." Nathan gathered his things efficiently. "It's the last place they'd look, and we can figure out your next steps from there." your ranch. The idea of going to this man's home made Abigail hesitate. I don't want to impose further, it's not much, Nathan interrupted, but it's defensible if it comes to that. He met her eyes directly. I gave you my word, Abigail. I'll get you safely to California if that's still where you want to go. Before she could respond, boots thumped on the stairs outside their door. Nathan moved with surprising speed, pulling Abigail behind him as the door burst open. Sheriff Patterson stood there, flanked by two hard-faced men. Neal, he spat. Thought that was a mighty convenient story about a wife I'd never heard of. What do you want, Patterson? Nathan's voice was deceptively calm, but Abigail could feel the tension in his body as she stood close behind him. These gentlemen say you stole something that belongs to Silas Morgan. The sheriff's gaze slid to Abigail. The girl. I don't belong to anyone, Abigail said fiercely, stepping out from behind Nathan. One of the men laughed. Silas paid good money to have you brought west, Miss Foster. Your father was mighty persuasive about your charms. The blood drained from Abigail's face. My father sold me. The words felt foreign on her tongue. Not sold, the man corrected with a smirk. Arranged for your future. Silas needs a wife, and your father needs Eastern connections for his business. We've been tracking you since St. Louis. Nathan's hand moved imperceptibly toward the gun at his hip. The lady's made her choice. She's not interested. Ain't up to her, the sheriff drawled. Or you. Now step aside, Neal, before you join her in a cell. What happened next was so quick Abigail hardly had time to register it. Nathan drew his gun, but instead of firing, he grabbed the wash basin and hurled it at the men. Water and porcelain sprayed across the room as he seized Abigail's hand. Run. He shouted, pulling her toward the window. The drop to the awning below wasn't far, and they slid down to the street as shouts erupted behind them. Nathan led her in a zigzag pattern through the awakening town, ducking between buildings and down alleys until they reached the livery. Mount up, he ordered, tossing her into his saddle before swinging up behind her. With a kick to the horse's flanks, they thundered out of Copper Creek, the sounds of pursuit fading behind them. They rode hard for hours, Nathan pushing his horse as much as he dared. Abigail clung to the saddle horn, her back pressed against Nathan's chest, his arms around her as he held the reins. Despite the danger, she found herself acutely aware of his warmth, the steady beat of his heart against her shoulder. When the horse needed rest, Nathan guided them to a small creek sheltered by cottonwoods. He helped her dismount, her legs wobbly from the long ride. Are you all right? He asked, steadying her with a hand at her elbow. I'm fine, she managed, though in truth she was far from it. My father sold me to a stranger. The reality of it hit her anew, bringing angry tears to her eyes. Nathan's expression softened. Men like your father and Silas Morgan see people as commodities, things to be traded. He busied himself with watering his horse. My father was the same. Traded my mother's happiness for land and cattle. She withered away before I was 10. Abigail watched him, seeing beyond the rugged exterior to the pain beneath. Is that why you helped me? Because of your mother, partly, he admitted, and partly because I've had my own run-ins with Morgan. He's been trying to drive me off my land for months. He straightened, looking at her directly. Mostly, though, it was the look in your eyes, same look I see in wild horses when they're first roped terrified but still fighting. Something warm unfurled in Abigail's chest at his words. Thank you, she said softly, meaning it more than she could express. Nathan nodded once, then turned back to his horse. We should keep moving. Morgan's men know these hills as well as I do. They continued north, staying off the main trails. As they rode, Nathan pointed out landmarks and told her about the territory which plants were edible, how to find water, the names of distant mountain ranges. Abigail listened, grateful for the distraction from her thoughts. By late afternoon, they crested a ridge and Nathan reined in the horse. Below them stretched a small valley, green with spring growth. A modest cabin stood near a clear stream with corrals and a small barn nearby. A few cattle grazed in the surrounding pasture. Welcome to the Neal Ranch, Nathan said, a hint of pride in his voice. Not much compared to Eastern standards, but it's mine. It's beautiful, Abigail said sincerely, taking in the peaceful scene. As they approached the cabin, a dog came bounding out, barking excitedly. Behind it came an older man, rifle raised cautiously until he recognized Nathan. "Boss." "Wasn't expecting you back so soon," the man called, lowering his weapon. "Change of plans, Pete," Nathan replied as they reached the yard. He dismounted, then helped Abigail down. "This is Miss Abigail Foster. She'll be staying with us for a while." He gave Pete a look that said there was more to the story. "Abigail, this is Pete Simmons, my foreman and the only other soul on this ranch." Pete tipped his hat, curiosity evident in his weathered face. "Madam, welcome to our humble abode." "Thank you," Abigail replied, suddenly self-conscious of her disheveled appearance. "Pete, take care of Dancer, would you? He's had a hard run." Nathan placed a hand at the small of Abigail's back, guiding her toward the cabin. "Let's get you settled." The cabin was simple but neat, with a main room serving as kitchen and living area and two doors leading off it, presumably bedrooms. A stone fireplace dominated one wall and the furnishings were basic but sturdy. "It's not much," Nathan said, watching her take it in. "It's wonderful," Abigail replied honestly. After the events of the past weeks, the small cabin seemed like a sanctuary. Nathan showed her to a small bedroom. "This was my mother's sewing room. The bed's narrow but comfortable." He hesitated in the doorway. "I'll fetch some water so you can wash up. There are some of my mother's clothes in the trunk. They might be old-fashioned, but they'll be cleaner than what you're wearing." Left alone, Abigail sank onto the bed, overcome by exhaustion and emotion. For the first time since fleeing Boston, she allowed herself to truly feel the weight of all that had happened: her father's betrayal, the dangers she'd faced, and the unexpected kindness of the stranger who had claimed her as his wife to save her. When Nathan returned with water, he found her crying silently. He set down the bucket, clearly uncomfortable with her tears but unwilling to leave her alone. "It will be all right," he said awkwardly, hovering near the door. Abigail wiped her eyes, embarrassed. "I'm sorry, I don't usually." "It's just been so much," Nathan nodded, understanding in his blue eyes. "Take all the time you need, supper won't be for a while yet." He closed the door softly behind him. After washing and changing into one of the simple dresses from the trunk, Abigail felt more like herself. The dress was a bit large but clean and whole, which was more than she could say for her own travel-worn clothing. When she emerged from the bedroom, she found Nathan and Pete at the table, deep in conversation. They broke off when they saw her, both men rising to their feet. "Feel better?" Nathan asked, his eyes taking in the transformation. "Much, thank you." Abigail smoothed the skirt of the faded blue dress. "I hope your mother wouldn't mind me borrowing her clothes." A shadow passed across Nathan's face. She would have been glad to help another woman in need. He pulled out a chair for her. "Hungry?" The meal was simple venison stew and biscuits, but to Abigail, it tasted better than any fine dinner she'd had in Boston. As they ate, Pete tactfully filled the silence with stories about the ranch and local happenings, never once asking what had brought Abigail to them. After supper, Pete excused himself to check on the livestock, leaving Nathan and Abigail alone by the fire. The spring evening had turned cool and the warmth of the flames was welcome. "Tomorrow I'll take you to town," Nathan said after a long silence. "Silver Springs, not Copper Creek. It's larger with a proper stage stop. You can book passage to California from there." Abigail stared into the fire, suddenly reluctant to resume her journey. "What if Morgan's men are watching the stage lines? They found me once before." Nathan frowned, considering this. "You could stay here until things cool down. A few weeks, maybe." "I couldn't impose. It's not an imposition," he interrupted. "I have the space and Pete could use the help with the cooking." His lips quirked in a half-smile. "He's a good man, but his biscuits could sink a ship." Abigail laughed, surprised at how good it felt. "Are you saying my biscuits were better?" "Considerably." Nathan's smile reached his eyes this time, transforming his serious face. "So will you stay, just until it's safer to travel?" She should say no. She barely knew this man, and yet, "Yes," she heard herself say. "Thank you." Nathan nodded, satisfied. "Good, that's settled then." He stood, stretching. "I'll show you around the place tomorrow. For now, you should get some rest." As he turned to bank the fire for the night, Abigail found herself studying him: the broad shoulders, the careful way he moved, the gentleness that seemed at odds with his rugged exterior. For the first time since leaving Boston, she felt truly safe. "Good night, Nathan," she said softly. He glanced back at her, something unreadable in his eyes. "Good night, Abigail." The weeks that followed fell into a comfortable rhythm. Abigail quickly made herself useful, taking over the cooking and mending, and even learning to tend the kitchen garden that had gone to seed after Nathan's mother died. Nathan, for his part, seemed to soften in her presence. He began to smile more, and occasionally she even coaxed a laugh from him with her attempts at ranch work. He taught her to ride properly, sitting astride rather than side saddle, and showed her the boundaries of his modest property. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains gold, Nathan broke their companionable silence. "Why California?" Abigail looked up from the shirt she was mending his shirt, torn during the day's work. "I have an aunt in San Francisco. She left Boston years ago to seek her fortune and scandalized the family by actually finding it. She owns a bookshop now." She smiled at the memory of her mother's eccentric sister. "She always told me to come to her if I needed a fresh start." Nathan nodded thoughtfully. "A bookshop sounds like something you'd enjoy. You think so?" She was pleased that he had noticed her love of reading, evident in how quickly she'd gone through the few books in his small collection. "You have a curious mind," he said simply, "and you're good with words." He looked out at the darkening landscape. "Morgan's men rode through Silver Springs yesterday. Pete heard it from the blacksmith. They're still looking for you." Abigail's hands stilled on her sewing. "Oh, you're safe here," Nathan assured her quickly. "But it might be a while longer before you can travel west." Was it wrong that the news didn't disturb her as much as it should? Abigail had found an unexpected peace here at the Neal ranch. The physical work was hard but satisfying, and the simplicity of the days suited her better than she would have imagined. And then there was Nathan. She stole a glance at his profile, strong and steady against the sunset. He had become important to her in ways she wasn't ready to examine too closely. "I'm not in a hurry," she said finally, returning to her mending. "If you and Pete don't mind the imposition." Nathan turned to look at her fully, his expression serious. "You're not an imposition, Abby. The place runs better with you here." He paused, as if weighing his next words. "It feels more like a home again." The simple admission warmed her more than it should have. Before she could respond, the sound of approaching hoofbeats broke the evening quiet. Nathan was on his feet instantly, hand moving to the gun at his hip. "Get inside," he ordered, his voice low and urgent. Abigail obeyed without question, watching through the window as 3 riders approached the yard. In the fading light, she couldn't make out their faces, but Nathan's posture relaxed slightly as they drew nearer. "Evening, Marshal," she heard him say. "What brings you out this way?" The lead rider dismounted, a tall man with a silver star gleaming on his chest. "Neal, sorry to disturb you. We're tracking some men who have been rustling cattle in the territory. Thought you might have seen something." Abigail breathed a sigh of relief. Not Morgan's men, then. She opened the door and stepped back onto the porch, feeling it was safe to join the conversation. The marshal noticed her immediately, his eyebrows rising in surprise. "Evening, madam. Didn't realize Neal here had company." Before Abigail could introduce herself, Nathan spoke. "Marshal Davis, this is my wife, Abigail." For the second time, Abigail found herself playing along with Nathan's claim of marriage. She stepped forward, smiling politely. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Marshal." The marshal removed his hat, revealing a shock of gray hair. "Well now, this is news. When did you get hitched, Neal?" "Last I heard you were determined to die a bachelor." "Few months back," Nathan said smoothly. "Quiet ceremony in Silver Springs." Marshal Davis chuckled. "That explains why you've been keeping to yourself lately." He turned to Abigail. "You must be something special, madam. This one's turned down every eligible female in 3 counties. Abigail felt her cheeks warm. "I consider myself very fortunate," she said, and was surprised to find she meant it. After declining their offer of supper, the marshal and his deputies continued on their patrol. When they were gone, Abigail turned to Nathan, a question in her eyes. "Why did you tell them I was your wife?" Nathan leaned against the porch rail, his face half in shadow. A single woman living with 2 unmarried men would raise questions. Questions lead to gossip, gossip leads to interest, and right now, interest in you could be dangerous. He straightened, moving toward the door. It seemed simpler. Abigail caught his arm as he passed. "Thank you again for protecting me." Nathan looked down at her hand on his arm, then at her face. Something changed in his expression, a softening around the eyes. "You don't need to thank me, Abby." He reached up, his fingers hovering near her cheek before he seemed to think better of it and let his hand drop. "I'll check on the horses before turning in." Abigail watched him stride toward the barn, confusion and something warmer churning within her. This man who had first claimed her as his wife to save her from exploitation had just done so again to protect her reputation. And somehow the pretense didn't feel as foreign as it should have. June slipped into July, and still Abigail remained at the Neal ranch. The threat from Morgan seemed to have receded, but neither she nor Nathan mentioned her departure. Life had settled into a pleasant routine that neither seemed eager to disrupt. One sweltering afternoon, Nathan suggested they ride to a swimming hole he knew, where the stream that ran through his property widened and deepened in the shade of ancient cottonwoods. Abigail, hot and dusty from working in the garden, eagerly agreed. The spot was as beautiful as he had described, cool and green amid the summer-browned landscape. Abigail sat on the bank, her feet dangling in the clear water, while Nathan swam in his trousers, his shirt discarded on a nearby rock. She tried not to stare at the play of muscles across his back and shoulders as he moved through the water, but found her gaze drawn to him again and again. When had this man, this virtual stranger who had stepped into her life on a whim of decency, become so essential to her happiness? Nathan surfaced near her feet, pushing wet hair from his eyes. "Water's perfect. Sure you won't come in?" Abigail laughed, splashing water at him with her foot. "And ruin my one good dress? I think not." He caught her ankle, his touch sending a jolt through her that had nothing to do with the cool water. "I could turn my back," he suggested, a teasing light in his eyes that she'd come to treasure. "Nathan Neal, are you suggesting I swim in my underclothes? How scandalous." But she was smiling as she said it, enjoying this playful side of him that emerged more often now. "No more scandalous than living with a man who's not really your husband," he replied, but the light in his eyes dimmed slightly. The reminder of their pretense hung between them. Abigail felt a sudden urge to bridge the gap that still existed between them, to know more about the man who had changed her life. "Tell me about your father," she said softly. "You mentioned once that he traded your mother's happiness. What did you mean?" Nathan released her ankle, moving back slightly in the water. For a moment she thought he wouldn't answer, but then he sighed. "My father was a hard man, came west with nothing but ambition and built this ranch through sheer force of will. He married my mother for her father's connections. She was from a good family back east, like you." He glanced up at her, then away. She wasn't prepared for the harshness of ranch life, but she tried. Lord, how she tried to make him happy, but nothing was ever enough. Abigail's heart ached for the young boy who had witnessed his mother's unhappiness. "What happened to them?" "Mother took ill when I was 10. Consumption, the doctor said, but I think her spirit just gave out. Father died 5 years later when his horse fell during a storm." Nathan's voice held no grief for his father, only a cold acceptance. "I've been running the place ever since, trying to do it differently than he did." "You have," Abigail said with certainty. "This is a good place, Nathan, a happy place." He looked up at her then, something vulnerable in his expression. "Happier since you came." The simple admission hung between them, heavy with implication. Abigail felt her heart quicken as Nathan moved closer, resting his arms on the bank beside her. "Abby," he began, his voice lower than usual. "I've been meaning to ask." The sound of approaching riders cut him off. Nathan was out of the water instantly, reaching for his gun belt even as he pulled his shirt back on. "Stay here," he ordered, all traces of the relaxed man gone, replaced by the wary rancher. "If I fire a shot, ride for Pete at the north pasture. Don't wait for me." Before she could protest, he was gone, moving silently through the trees toward the sound. Abigail sat frozen, straining to hear what was happening. Minutes stretched like hours until finally Nathan's voice carried back to her. "Abby, it's all right. Come on up." She hurried toward his voice, relief flooding her until she emerged from the trees and saw who stood with him: Sheriff Patterson and 2 men she recognized from Copper Creek. "Well, Mrs. Neal," Patterson drawled, his small eyes gleaming with malice. "Fancy meeting you here." Nathan moved to stand between her and the men. "What do you want, Patterson? You're outside your jurisdiction." "Just being neighborly," the sheriff replied. "Ran into Marshal Davis last week. He mentioned you'd gotten yourself a wife. Got me thinking about that pretty little thing you claimed was already married to you back in June." His gaze slid to Abigail. Imagine my surprise when he described her exact. One of the men with Patterson stepped forward. "Silas Morgan wants what's his, Neal. The girl was promised to him fair and square." "I was never promised to anyone," Abigail said fiercely. "My father had no right, your father had every right," the man interrupted. "You're his daughter, his property until married." And Silas paid good money. Nathan's fist connected with the man's jaw before he could finish, sending him sprawling in the dirt. In an instant, guns were drawn all around. "That was a mistake, Neal," Patterson said, his revolver aimed steadily at Nathan's chest. "Now we can do this easy or hard. The girl comes with us either way." Abigail felt cold fear grip her heart. She couldn't go with these men, couldn't face the fate that awaited her with Silas Morgan, and she couldn't bear to see Nathan hurt because of her. "I'll go," she said suddenly, stepping forward. "If you leave him alone, I'll go with you." "Abby, no," Nathan started, but she silenced him with a look. "It's my choice, Nathan," she turned to Patterson. "I'll come quietly, but only if you swear not to harm him." Patterson considered this, then nodded. "Fine by me." "Morgan just wants you, not trouble with the ranchers." He gestured to his men. "Get her on a horse." Nathan moved with the speed of a striking snake, drawing his gun and firing in one fluid motion. Patterson's hat flew off his head as a bullet grazed it, and the sheriff stumbled backward in shock. "Next one goes between your eyes," Nathan said, his voice deadly calm. "My wife isn't going anywhere with you." The standoff might have ended in bloodshed if not for the sound of more riders approaching Pete, leading 3 of Nathan's ranch hands, all armed and grim-faced. "Everything all right, boss?" Pete called, his rifle trained on Patterson's men. Nathan didn't take his eyes off the sheriff. "Just explaining to these gentlemen that they're trespassing on private property and threatening my wife." Outnumbered now, Patterson slowly lowered his gun. "This ain't over, Neal. Morgan doesn't take kindly to being crossed." "Neither do I," Nathan replied evenly. "Now get off my land." They watched as Patterson and his men rode away, tension thick in the air until they disappeared from sight. Only then did Nathan holster his gun, turning to Abigail with concern etched on his face. "Are you all right?" She nodded, though her hands were shaking. "You called me your wife again." "So I did." He looked at her steadily, something resolute in his gaze. "Pete, take the men back to the house. We'll be along shortly." When they were alone, Nathan took Abigail's trembling hands in his. "They'll be back," he said quietly, "with more men next time, I know." Abigail looked up at him, fear and determination warring within her. "I should leave, get as far away as possible." "I've brought nothing but trouble to your door." Nathan's grip on her hands tightened. "You're not going anywhere without me, Abigail Foster." His voice was rough with emotion. "Not unless that's truly what you want." "What I want," she searched his face, hardly daring to hope. "What about what you want?" "I want you to stay," he said simply. "Not as a pretend wife, not as a guest, as my partner in every way." He took a deep breath. "I love you, Abby. I think I have since you stood in that cell and refused to give Patterson your name." Joy bloomed in Abigail's chest, bright and warm. "I love you too," she whispered, the words feeling right, true. "I don't want to leave, not ever." Nathan's smile was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. He cupped her face in his hands, his touch infinitely gentle. "Then marry me." "For real this time?" "Yes," Abigail answered without hesitation. "Yes, I'll marry you." His kiss was everything she had dreamed it might be, tender yet passionate, a promise and a claiming all at once. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, Nathan rested his forehead against hers. "We'll need to deal with Morgan," he said, practical even in this moment of joy. "And your father eventually." "We will," Abigail agreed. "Together." She smiled up at him. "After all, I'm your wife already, am I not?" Nathan laughed, the sound echoing across the water. "So you are, Mrs. Neal." "So you are." They were married 3 days later by a circuit preacher who happened to be passing through Silver Springs. It was a simple ceremony in the town's small church, with Pete as witness and a handful of neighboring ranchers in attendance. Word spread quickly about the wedding and about Morgan's attempts to claim Abigail. To Nathan's surprise, the community rallied around them. Morgan might have had money and political connections, but Nathan had earned respect through years of fair dealings. When Morgan's men rode onto Neal land a week after the wedding, they were met not just by Nathan and his hands, but by a dozen neighboring ranchers, all armed and determined. Marshal Davis was with them, his star gleaming in the summer sun. "This ends now," the marshal told Morgan's foreman. "The lady is legally married, witnessed, and recorded. Any claim Morgan thought he had is null and void." He fingered his gun meaningfully. "Unless he wants to discuss it with a federal judge in Tucson." The threat of federal involvement was enough to make Morgan back down, though Abigail knew the danger wouldn't truly pass until her father received the letter she had written, explaining her marriage and warning him against further interference in her life. As summer faded into fall, life at the Neal Ranch settled into a new rhythm. Abigail took to ranch life with surprising ease, her determination more than making up for her lack of experience. She started a small school for the children of neighboring ranches, teaching 3 days a week in the front room of their cabin. Nathan watched her flourish with a sense of wonder, grateful every day for the twist of fate that had brought her into his life. The cabin that had once felt empty now rang with laughter and plans for the future: a larger house, more cattle, perhaps children of their own one day. On their 3-month anniversary, Nathan took Abigail back to the swimming hole where he had first told her he loved her. The cottonwoods were turning gold now, their leaves drifting down to dance upon the water's surface. "Happy?" he asked, his arm around her waist as they watched the sunset paint the water in shades of fire. Abigail leaned into him, content in a way she had never imagined possible. "More than I ever thought I could be." She turned in his embrace, her green eyes bright with love. "Thank you for claiming me as your wife that day in Copper Creek," Nathan smiled, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "Best lie I ever told," he said before kissing her soundly. "Though I much prefer the truth of it now." "As do I, Mr. Neal," Abigail replied, standing on tiptoe to kiss him again. "As do I." In the years that followed, whenever anyone asked how they met, Nathan would always begin the story the same way. "Well, they tried to sell her to the sheriff, and I said, 'She's my wife already.'" And Abigail would laugh and squeeze his hand, grateful for the man who had claimed her first in pretense, and then in truth, changing both their lives forever.